Welcome to episode 143 of the Brainy Business, Understanding the Psychology of Why People Buy. In today's episode, I'm excited to introduce you to Michael F. Schein, author of the Hype Handbook. Ready? Let's get started.
You are listening to the Brainy Business Podcast, where we dig into the psychology of why people buy and help you incorporate behavioral economics into your business, making it more brain-friendly. Now here's your host, Melina Palmer.
Hello, everyone. My name is Melina Palmer, and I want to welcome you to the Brainy Business Podcast. Today, I'm so excited to introduce you to Michael F. Schein. I first met Michael a few months ago when he reached out to me about an article he was writing for Psychology Today about the top podcasts related to psychology for people in business. The Brainy Business was one of the shows on his list, so he asked if I was open to an interview to learn a little more about me and the show to determine if it was a fit for the article. Semi-spoiler alert, you may already know that the article has since come out, and the Brainy Business didn't just make the list, it's in the number one spot on that list. We also got to talking about his upcoming book at that time, which he was kind enough to send me an advanced copy of, and after reading it, I could tell it had some really great insights for you listeners. Of course, it's rooted in psychology, but it's also full of great stories from across history and disciplines, which I really love. And I also really like that the title of the book includes a term that some might find controversial: hype. I asked him about it in the episode, but I wonder what you think about hype going into the conversation. Do you feel like hyping up yourself or your business is a good thing, or does it feel a little shady? Michael explains his perspective of why it's good, his definition, and we dig in on some of the 12 strategies to use hype in your business to create and leverage it for good so you can attract attention from the right people, create a community of people who love you, and so much more during our conversation today. And we also touch on several concepts that have their own past episodes, including those on herding, biases, the dose brain chemicals, framing, and many more. Those are all linked for you in the show notes, along with links to connect with Michael and get your own copy of the Hype Handbook. It can all be found within the app you're listening to or at thebrainybusiness.com/143. Those already on the Brainy Business list got a direct link from me in the email you receive every Friday. Not on the list yet? Simply sign up for any freebie at thebrainybusiness.com and you'll be automatically added. And for those of you in the States, you can sign up easily by texting the word Brainy, BRAINY, to 33777. You'll be added to the list and get access to a super secret subscribers page with more than 50 freebies as a thank you. All right. Let's jump right in. Without further ado, Michael F. Schein, welcome to the Brainy Business Podcast.
I am so happy to be here, Melina.
Oh, great. Well, I'm so excited to have you and so excited that we got serendipitously connected at the right time at the end of 2020, I think. So if you can tell the audience a little bit about you, would love to learn about your background and, how you got into doing the work that you do.
Well, sort of the brief version of the story, if I can speak briefly, which is hard for me to do, but I own a company called Microfame Media, and what we do in a thumbnail is we work with idea-driven businesses. So any kind of business that, as you would think, has an idea behind it, but meaning we wouldn't be great to market a raw materials company or a ball bearing company. But if, consultancies and publishing houses that have media products, certain tech startups, we're really good at finding a niche that's out there, figuring out like a contrarian point of view. What does this company or the people behind the company or the person behind the company have to say that is sort of not what everyone else is saying, and then do a whole flood of activity that gets them known in that arena for certain goals. And while we're a marketing agency, I don't like to think of it that way. I think of us as a hype agency because I learned how to do this stuff in a very sort of weird way. I played in punk bands and I did like Mischief and that sort of thing. And we can talk about that. And I figured out that a lot of the strategies and tactics used by Mischief Makers, both benevolent mischief makers and otherwise are a lot more effective than your typical social media. How many Instagram followers can you get? HubSpot, whatever. Those are all tools, but a lot of times people focus on that stuff. They don't focus on the actual mass psychology that gets people to buy stuff. So, before I did any of that, and since I was 5 years old, I wanted to be a writer. And I was a writer my whole life. I wrote fiction, I wrote articles, I still do. And so I recently wrote a book about these concepts called the Hype Handbook, where I look at propaganda artists and cult leaders and rock and hip hop managers and pranksters. And I say, are there principles and strategies we can extract from these people and reapply ethically to get what we want out of life? And that's been a really, really fun project that speaks to my heart. And fortunately, some people are reading it and liking it.
Yeah. Well, I'm one of those people, to be sure. And I appreciate in it, I love any book or documentary or something you would watch where it weaves together so many stories that seem like they don't have anything in common, and they're from all sorts of eras and backgrounds and just anything possible, but finding the thread that helps them to make sense and putting together, this is from the 13th century monk, and then this is from Alice Cooper, and this is how they come together or whatever, right? Which I know that I don't think those ones actually went together, but so I like that because it helps to show that love of the research and the learning. And I think it just goes to show how much went into creating a book or a story when you have such a vast array of examples to pull from. It tells the story in a way too, where if I don't relate to a particular example, the next one is right there, and just kind of keep going and jump right in.
Thank you for the compliment. And one of the reasons I did that was for the reasons you said, that I like doing that kind of research. It's a fun read when you have those kind of stories. But there's another reason as well, and it's that people throughout history, certain people have been really effective, more effective than others, at getting large numbers of people into a transcendent state and then getting them to do what they want. And I think sometimes we think, we say, it's the social media era and it's the internet era, and we have to learn landing pages and that's going to change everything. But, I guess I was trying to make the point through all those examples that whether you were Augustus commissioning the Aeneid to legitimize your rule, or Richard Branson flying a hot air balloon, or a modern tech guru playing with certain dynamics on social media, the underlying psychological principles are ancient. And people forget that. They think too much about the tools. It's like focusing on getting the right hammers and chainsaws, but not getting an architect.
Right. Yeah, for sure. I've always enjoyed the quote, which sort of applies here, but when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail.
Yeah. There's a lot of that going on now. Yeah.
Right. So if all you're looking at is social, and I think that there is a really great lesson in one of the big problems that I've always seen is when you go to look for kind of that silver bullet and how'd they get their 1 million followers? Yeah. And then I'm going to do exactly what they did. But what they did has been done now. And so while it was innovative and different and stood out when they did it, if I go wear a meat dress now, it doesn't have the same significance as, when Lady Gaga went out in the meat dress.
That's why you need to learn principles instead of tactics, strategies instead of tactics. I'll see these books and they're useful. I'm not don't get me wrong. Technology is important, but you'll see these things, I remember I read a book once when I was really new at this. It was Google Plus, and it was basically how to use Google Plus. It's tied to the search engine, so it's everything, and it's going to make your marketing dreams come true. And I sort of bought into it at that time because I was new, and Google Plus doesn't even exist anymore, right? So it's but if you know how humans work in groups and how their brains inefficiently process information, then you can feel really secure that you'll find your own version of the meat dress or your own version of Google Plus, because you know what drives human beings on a more fundamental level. Yeah.
Good news for every listener of the Brainy Business, because that's what we do here, understanding what the brain does so we can, better communicate and market and all the things. So I do think before we jump into some of those principles of the Hype Handbook, I do think that some people may, for better or worse, and in your case, potentially this is a good thing, but some people may rebel a little bit against the concept or the word of hype, to where it feels like hype is empty, or maybe someone would say it feels kind of sleazy, which I know it's not, and that's not what's included here in the book. But why did you choose that particular term, and what does it mean for you in the work that you do?
Well, first of all, a lot of hype artists are sleazy, right? I mean, there are people who apply. I mean, I have examples of people in the book who are scumbags, but they're really effective at affecting large numbers of people. And they use some of the same underlying strategies that really good people do. So you have to say to yourself, you have two choices. You can say, I wish the world were different, and I'm not going to understand how humans are. Or you can say, I'm a good person, or at least I try to be, and I'm trying to sell good products and good services and good art and whatever. What if I learned from those other people and tried to reapply what they do ethically? But why did I use that word? So I want to sort of take it back. I mean, for so long, it's been considered a negative word. But, there's one community that has never considered hype a negative word, and it's the hip hop community. Because in hip hop, hype was what you had to do to get your music out there. No one was helping you up. I mean, helping you out. Hip hop originally comes from very poor neighborhoods where the main practitioners did not have advantages. So it's very easy when, you're on a sort of, the word now is privileged, right? When you're on a privileged career track, it's easy to say, this is how you waggle your finger and say, this is how you should do things. But in hip hop, there were never those kind of pretensions. There was always a hype man in a rap group who was responsible for hyping up the crowd, hyping up the street teams, hyping up whoever was involved. And I just like that aesthetic. We're all in disadvantaged circumstances at some point in our lives, some more than others, but we're all in periods of our lives where, to more or less of an extent, we need to think creatively. And as long as you're not lying and deceiving people and selling them stuff that they don't need, I'm all for hyping things up.
Absolutely. And I know you do talk about this in the book, but because we're a herding species, being able to see where someone is being energetic and excited, and then you get some more people that are energetic and excited, and they're doing the, clap along with us sort of thing, and everybody kind of follows suit, is, there's some mirror neurons in there. That instinct to herd is a big reason why something like that works. It definitely got me thinking about one of my very favorite TED talks about how to start a movement.
Is that the Derek Sivers one, or who?
Yeah.
One person is dancing and
Yes. And so I've talked about it on the show before. There's the one, if you're just the only person and everyone can't be a leader. And he talks about not underestimating the value of that first follower and the person who believes in you and supports it and talks about you really early on, that takes you from being the lone weirdo to the beginning of a movement when you have someone else kind of behind you and supporting you. And I think in a lot of ways, that's, part of what the hype man does.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I think sometimes I'm interested in various types of artwork, whether it's art proper or literature or music. And, we think of art movements as just these steady things, like things are good or they're bad. But when abstract art, Cubism or Dadaism, when that first came out, it got people so agitated and worked up that there were riots. And now it's so blasé, abstract art, that it's used by interior decorators. You know what I mean? Like you don't see an interior decorator put up a Norman Rockwell thing anymore. It's always like a bunch of squiggles and a cube, and it's like wallpaper. That's how normal and boring Cubism is, right? And it's the same art. So like context and what you're saying, it's like the first person who, if there was only one person who was drawing cubes and squares 150 years ago, they would have been in a mental institution or just a weirdo on the street. Once there were 5, it was a bunch of bohemians. And once it was 50 million, it's wallpaper.
Right. Definitely the ebb and flow or the life cycle of anything. And it's important to know where you are to kind of interject and get that sort of controversial point and whatnot that you can come up with, which I know is, I believe it's the hype tactic number 1 is that controversial, or at least you talk about it in the intro to the book. Yeah. So I don't know if you want to start there. I'm not expecting we will talk about all 12 today. Sure. So I want also for you, if you have a favorite tactic you want to start with, or one you don't get to talk about very much, would always love to bring those out into the mix.
Well, I think we should talk about the first type strategy, which is called make war, not love, because in some ways, it's not an accident that it was chapter 1. It is in many ways the strategy that all of the rest of the strategies are built on. So because you have a sciencey crowd, I'm going to go into some of the deep science that I don't always go into. But there was an anthropologist quite a few years ago now who did some really cool research, an anthropologist and an archaeologist who worked together. And they found this alcove in South Africa, on like the southwest coast of Africa, that they found evidence that there was a very dense source of shellfish, like 100,000 years ago. I'm probably getting the numbers wrong, but back when we were hunter-gatherers. And by looking at sort of the climatic data and whatever, they found out there was a climate change event at that time that almost made Homo sapiens go extinct. Like basically our species was reduced to this very, very, very small number of people who retreated from the savannah to this southwest coast of Africa. And they have a very strong data-backed hypothesis right now that this tribe, everyone on Earth, including you and me and every listener, is descended from this small group of people, a handful of tribes. And they didn't have to hunt and they didn't have to gather because they had this dense calorie source, this shellfish. And so the only thing keeping them from this food was other tribes. And there were only a small number of tribes. So basically, it's selected for traits. If you were really good at cooperating with people that you artificially deemed to be like you had a certain name of the tribe, the physical features obviously wouldn't be that different because it was, one group of people, but whatever, some artificial designation, you cooperated like crazy with people like that and really hated people who weren't like that. That was selected for. Those were the people who survived. And so every human on Earth, whether we like it or not, has this dynamic. We fight it, but we all have it in different ways. So we're all wired very strongly to like people we perceive as being us and ideas we perceive as being us, and disliking very strongly ideas and people who aren't like us. And actually oxytocin, which is the cuddle chemical, which we consider the thing that makes us love our children and love our long-term partners, is the same chemical that behind racism. It's the same brain chemical that makes us hate people. So why is this significant? Because as much as you want to fight it, people, and that includes you, listener, are more attracted to their tribalism and being against stuff as they are being for stuff. Like you'll see these very vegan, lovey-dovey liberals, and they'll have on their online dating profiles, if you're a Trump fan, do not approach me, do not contact me. Because we feel how we feel about Trump, et cetera, but that's a strong reaction for a political party. So how do you play with this without being a jerk? Position yourself against an idea, right? So ask yourself, let's say you're in a business field. It could be any field, but let's say you're in some kind of business. What is a point of view commonly spouted in your industry that everyone kind of just like preaches as gospel and you disagree with, you think is wrong? Put yourself up as the crusader against that point of view, if you really feel that way. And I assure you, there are other people who feel the same way as you, who don't have, it's that follower principle. They don't have the first person to speak up yet, but you become the guy waggling your hands or the lady waggling your hands. You're that first dancer. And then all those other people now have a leader to create a new tribe around. And I'm telling you, we can go through examples, but it is probably the most powerful thing you can do to build energy around whatever you're out there doing.
Yeah. Well, let's go ahead and jump into at least one example to help people to see how that could work for them and tips maybe.
Well, I'll give an example from the business world that's not at all about people, that's not at all personal. And I like those examples because it's almost easy to demonize a human being and make a scapegoat. But that's where, while it's effective, you can get in really tricky territory doing that, right? Ethically.
Yeah.
So I think there's a time and place for that, actually. If people are saying things that you disagree with, you can call them out. But an example that I like is Basecamp, which is a project management software, which for a lot of people would be considered about as milquetoast and boring of a field you could possibly think of. But they did a cool thing with it, the founders. So essentially, the MO in the project management space before them was that you built as many features into your project management tool as you could. Now, a project management tool, for those of you who don't know, it's what it would seem like. It's a piece of software that everyone on a team uses to do the different parts of a project that are necessary to happen at the same time to execute something, which can get complicated. So the idea was clients would ask for different features and the company would build them in and then give them to everybody else. Because why not have more stuff? I mean, why have something do 20 things if you can have them do 30 things, right? So what the founders of this tool, Basecamp, did, they created a project management tool which does don't quote me on this, but 5 things really well. It's really stripped down. But they didn't go out and say, our tool is simple, so it's easy to use. That's what most people would do. What they did was they wrote books and blog posts and this and that, a crusade around inefficiency and stupid workaholism. So their whole thing was, if you're working 7-day weeks, that's not because you're a hard worker. It's because you are overcomplicating things. And that's the sign of a cluttered mind. They would say, fire your workaholics. So they turned this project management thing, a piece of technology, into this crusade. So instead of selling a tool, they created this tribe against overwork culture. But you need something to help you with it. So of course you're going to use their software, right?
Right. Yeah.
And they've done insanely well. And it's the kind of product where, someone gets Salesforce. It's like, I'm using Salesforce because it's the best tool. Someone gets Basecamp and it's like, I love Basecamp. I love Jason Fried and DMM, the founders. I read Rework 5 times, the book they wrote. So it's like this religion thing. And they just use that adversarial dynamic that we're talking about to make that happen in a very ethical way. I mean, it's a great tool.
Well, and there are people who still love project management software and use other systems, of course.
Of course there are. And sometimes you need a more complex system. I mean, Right.
Yeah. But for most businesses, you look at that and go, ugh. Right. That looks terrible. So I've got notes here to link to the episode on the overwhelmed brain and what it does for decision making. So that's in the notes, as well as some other things we've talked about so far as, our personal biases towards ourselves, as well as other groups, dose brain chemicals. It'll all be linked in the show notes, along with lots of other things that we don't necessarily call out in the discussion. But yeah, picking something that in your heart of hearts, you passionately disagree with, that is important too, which I know brings up to one of the other principles, which might be 4 or 5, but it's in the dressing for the right part and really having to live the whatever it is and not be inauthentic, essentially, or it has to do with the packaging, I think was the way that you phrased it. But, that I think really ties in with, you can't just pick something that you think would be controversial if you don't agree or live that.
Yeah, no, exactly. I see people do. So there's a quote by these guys, Elliot Aronson and Anthony Propagandists, who, if you haven't mentioned them, I don't know. They're really interesting social scientists. They're the foremost kind of students on propaganda, not students, but really masters, professors of propaganda and group psychology. And they have this quote that says let me get it right. It's the essence of propaganda is a well-designed package. And I think people go wrong in two ways. On one hand, they're very cynical and they say, I'm going to try to pick fights and be a rabble rouser just for the sake of it. And that's just trolling. People can sense that a mile away. Just being a jerk for the sake of being a jerk can get you in trouble, but it doesn't usually work. People just get annoyed, with exceptions. But I think what other people do is they think about their packaging or their quote unquote branding in this very surface level way, or piecemeal way. So they redesign their website. They get a hip new logo. When they go to a tech conference, instead of wearing a tie, which they would have done 15 years ago, they wear expensive sneakers and a blazer over a black t-shirt because that's hip, right? But if you look at the real masters of what I call hype, but you could call them gurus or figures, thought leaders, or celebrities in their niche, whatever, they have a public persona that is almost a caricature version of who they are at their core. And they never let it down. It is woven through everything they are and everything they do. So how do you do that? How do you make that happen? Well, the trick is, and I do talk about this in the book, is don't start with your obvious strengths. Because let's say you're a really assertive and efficient person and you're in business. Well, there are probably millions of other assertive and efficient people. That's like table stakes, right? But imagine if you're absent-minded and meek, and that gives you a whole lot of angst, and that gives you a whole lot of insecurity. Well, can you find a strength buried in that weakness? Because that's where your uniqueness is. So let me give you an example. This isn't the business world, but this person happened to be a very good business person as well as a good artist. But it was Andy Warhol. He always could draw well and paint well. But he was in the 40s, which is when he was a kid. He was gay, which was illegal. And he was quite obviously gay. Like, he wasn't able to hide it very well. He was insanely shy, to social anxiety levels. That's what they would call it now. He had a receding hairline at a very early age. And before him, the artists that were popular were the abstract expressionists, which were very manly men, like Jackson Pollock. It was like these tough kind of guys. So he could have tried to hide all of that. People before him had. But what did he do? He accentuated his shyness and his sort of the feminine side of himself. So like when the press would say to him, why are you painting cans of soup? Artists before him would have gone into this whole diatribe about what they meant and what they were going for. And he would say, I like soup. And people would, what did he mean? And they would just pick it apart forever. Or he wore this garish silver wig that he's now famous for. He was balding at an early age. Now, he could have worn a toupee, or he could have had just the balding hair, but he just was like, I'm going to wear this obvious, ridiculous wig, So that's what we know him for. And he was such a good business person. He created the factory. He created like the modern artist that had a team of people mass producing artwork, right? But he was the opposite of what you would think of as a good traditional business person. So find your insecurity and be real honest with yourself, because that's what you're going to be able to be consistent with, not something that you're faking.
Right. Yeah. If you want to have something that you can just really live.
Yeah, really.
To be in integrity with yourself for one thing, but it just makes it, people can pick up on, I know you said something about confidence in the book, which I talk about a lot, and it being a priming thing. Often I'll talk about it when we're looking at pricing strategy. And so if you are telling someone how much it costs and you are not confident in that price, whatever it is, or what people are going to get, or what your value proposition is, people can smell that lack of confidence in the same way that, dogs smell fear, sort of a thing.
What you're saying is 100% true. Speaking with authority and confidence is true. And there's a wrinkle to that. Like in everything else in life, there's a paradox. If you try to be confident in a way that isn't natural, it will fail. So, for example, a lot of times when people hear be confident, they look at naturally confident people like who have a brash, assertive confidence. And if that's you, you should do that. But if that's not you, see if you can embrace a different kind of confidence. So I'll give you an example. So I'm kind of a people pleaser by nature. I don't know why. And I used to dislike that about myself because I looked at a lot of the entrepreneur type people that I admired, and they tended to be very direct and this sort of thing. And I was like, oh gosh. And I would try to do that. And whenever I would try to like speak directly and, this and this, it was quite obvious. I would overcompensate. I couldn't really hold it for too long, But when I started to embrace that other part of who I was, so there's a part of being a people pleaser, especially the kind I am, more powerful people tend to really want to take me under their wing and help me out. So I found that strength in what we do, and I use it all the time. So like, for example, I'll talk to you. I hyped you up, but in a way that helps both of us, right? I said to you, I wrote you a very Mike Schein email, that basically said, I have an article coming out, which I only put people on the list that I thought were the best podcasts because I wanted to be on their podcast. I want to be on the best podcast. But I said, I have, an article coming out, and I would love to have a conversation with you about whether you would be a good fit for this best podcast, psychology podcast for business people, article I'm doing on Psychology Today. Oh, by the way, I have a book coming out. Maybe you'd think about it for your podcast. And then we got on the phone and we hit it off, but I'm good at hitting it off with people, So in other words, now that I know I can be that guy, I'm extremely confident in that persona. But if I have to be the like screaming and yelling, hammering people, I just can't do it. So I don't know. I guess what I'm saying here is it's a paradox. The only way to be confident is to get confident in your natural state.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Definitely to me. And I think there is a lot of owning whatever it is about you instead of, I want to link to the episode on survivorship bias, where when we look at, in this case, articles that say all the successful people get up at 5 a.m. or 3 a.m. or whatever it is now, everyone who's successful does this, all the billionaires dropped out of college and whatever. When you only look at that small sample and what they think is what got them there is not necessarily what it is. Right. Hindsight is not 2020, actually. Hindsight is super messed up in what we think happened and why it all went together. And so you say, oh, it must be because I get up at 5 a.m. every day and that's why I'm successful. And you get 10 other people that say, oh yeah, I get up at 5 a.m. too. Confirmation bias in there, of course, as well, as we're looking for people who get up early and then are successful. But what about all the successful people that don't get up at 5 a.m.? What about all the people who get up at 5 a.m. and are not successful?
Yeah.
And all those people you're not looking at. And so knowing that just because you don't see whatever it is that makes you powerful out in the powerful people that you're seeing present doesn't mean that it can't work. And actually, if it's not uber present, like you were talking about in Make War Not Love, is then you can be the first one, which makes it more likely to be something that starts your snowball and can all go together.
And this brings up another point. I love what you're saying about the survivorship bias, because you have to understand that a lot of the people, the gurus, the success people who are really successful are successful because they hype themselves up. Everyone from Tony Robbins to Ryan Holiday to Elon Musk to, Brené Brown to Oprah, right? So they're all creating the best ones. The only survivorship bias is to realize that they're all creating caricature versions of themselves. So do you guys know who Ryan Holiday is in this kind of universe? I mean, is that because in the marketing world, he's a pretty popular
I think it's fair
figure.
To say that some people don't. So if you want to.
So he's this guy who, he was a 21-year-old head of marketing at American Apparel. He really talented, moved on to becoming this sort of apostle of stoicism, writing a book called The Obstacle is the Way, which was a big book, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And he writes these articles with such authority on like, you need to do this, you need to do that, read lots of books, read them this way, take notes. And there's a lot of great wisdom in them. I happen to like his stuff. However, it's no accident that he's a marketer. Does he always follow these rules? In other words, even if getting up at 5 a.m. is a better thing to do, which it isn't always, you have to ask yourself, are these people really the perfect version of what they're putting out there? Or are they presenting a version of themselves that's going to get you in a peak state or a transcendent state or a bought-in state so you'll buy their products?
Right.
Sometimes I think it's better to watch what they're doing to get you to buy from them versus following their advice, especially the self-help people, because it's a business.
Yes. That's going to conferences or looking at, I sign up for so many people's lead magnets and email lists and whatever, just to see what's out there and what's working for people. And it's, when you go into it looking for those insights and tips, it's amazing what you can really pick up on. And some of it, maybe you want to emulate. Some of it you go, I wouldn't want to do that. And that's great. We all get to pick our own paths for that.
But it's better to do what you're doing and create a swipe file of the things they're using to persuade you than it is to read their articles and follow their advice. Because their ultimate goal is to sell you more stuff. Like Tony, another hype strategy is theater and drama. And you can do that on a small scale or a big scale, but there's theatrical elements, whether it's lights and sound or framing on your Zoom screen, staging and framing. But Tony Robbins, everyone follows his advice. They say, I'm going to be a superstar and a business guru, and I'm going to follow all of his things that he tells me to do. But what they're not thinking about is that Tony Robbins gets a bunch of people in a room, bombards them with lights and sounds and positive aphorisms and this and that. And by the time you left, you've signed up to 3 more seminars. So why isn't everybody who's following his advice as rich as Tony Robbins? If you really want to be rich, break down how he's bombarding your senses in the room to get you to open your wallet again, because he's the one living in a castle, not you.
Right, definitely. So just as we look at this here, so of the 12 hype strategies, we've talked about make war, not love, perfect your packaging. We've talked about embrace theater and drama. I would love, so we didn't dig in too much on it, but I think this is something that fits for this group for sure as we kind of wrap up our conversation, since we don't get you for all 12. But would say, I think make it scientific is one that applies for this group. It's people who love the learning, and those tactics I think are interesting for these people, of how you can use facts and figures in a way that is not boring, but can give some authority to somebody, sharing that in a really positive way.
When doing the research for this book, I really had an insight that I found interesting. If you're trying to put across an idea that's truly, truly new, or a product or a concept or a service, you want to make it as simple and stripped down as possible, because human beings don't like change. And to the point where we actually release hormones when there's too much change that's too sudden. So if you're truly doing something new, people are going to reject it unless you not only state it simply, but introduce it in stages. Just give them a little bit at a time. However, if you're in a field that's overcrowded, even if your stuff is good, but let's say you're a life coach, right? And you're a really good life coach. When you're working with somebody, you're going to get good results. However, there are thousands and thousands of life coaches. And even though your stuff works, you're not really breaking any new ground. Effective isn't the same as new. You're just effective. Well, in that case, you need to show that you're an extra special authority. You need to do the visual and verbal equivalent of the doctor's white coat, because our brains, and you've talked about this, our brains are not set up to parse and digest the billions of bits of stimuli that we receive all the time. If you had to make real decisions about everything, your head would blow off your shoulders. I mean, you couldn't do it. So what we do is we're evolved to use heuristics. We see something a couple times that's an indicator of authority or of competence. And when we see that same symbol again, our brain subconsciously trusts that that person is competent. So what's an example of that? Scientific lingo. So you're seeing 5 different life coaches, right? And one life coach is saying, oh, I go with the spirits and the vibes and the thing. Okay, that appeals to some people. But what if another one talks about the oxytocin that is released, or the neuroepinephrine that bonds you and makes you more focused? And and this chart and this grid, if you have a 16 boxed grid with different codes and numbers, that's each of your personality qualities. That's the way a scientist talks. That's the way a psychologist talks. And suddenly that person becomes an expert, right? And we see this all the time. I talk about, consultants do this. Think about the consulting industry. I mean, the biggest consulting firms, right? Like McKinsey and BCG and all of this, they do good work. At the same time, you're basically getting a 23-year-old kid from Wharton to tell someone who's been doing their job for 45 years how to do their job better. So when you listen to consultants talk behind the scenes, they call it eye candy. They'll say the most simple thing in the world, use digital technology, and they'll do it in a 45-page deck that they charge $100,000 for, which is a heuristic in itself, because if you're paying that much money, it must be valuable. And they have statistical breakdowns and charts and figures and grids. And at the end, it's like, use digital technology, use digital marketing. And they get paid. So eye candy, ear candy, scientific lingo, using those heuristics is, if you're in a crowded space, it's almost vital if you want to set yourself apart and get people to buy in. Now, it should be true.
Yes.
But common sense isn't always that well accepted.
Right. Well, and as you said on where that first principle of war, not love, and picking something that you're a little bit different. So for me, while the information that I share is very scientific, but looking at the field of behavioral economics, especially when I was coming in and wanting to be doing the podcast and everything, my controversial piece was being able to say, everything sounds like a lecture and is very weighted in p-values and variance and statistical significance that an average person in business does not want or need. And so I can share this in a way that is making that relatable and usable. And in a marketing space, I'm scientific. For most behavioral economists, I'm not in the way that I talk about the field.
But what you did is, even though we're used to behavioral economics now, it's the newest branch of economics. Mm-hmm. You don't study it in Econ 1 or 2. People still dispute it. So it's cutting edge stuff.
Yeah.
So what you've done is taken forward thinking stuff that a lot of people aren't ready to accept. There are still classical economists who don't believe in it. You've boiled it down into simple, almost sloganistic language that the common, I don't mean like common person in a negative way, that people who aren't PhDs understand. So you've used the first tactic.
Right.
But if you're a life coach, which it's like an professional advice giver with it's just, they can be the most helpful people in the world, and it can be someone who thinks they're smart or in tune with the spirits. It's the most crowded space ever, and there's no rigor to it as a field. At that point, you need to put rigor on top of it. Does that mean that's a delicate distinction? But
right.
I would say you're in the first group where you're dealing with complexity and things that most human beings don't intuitively understand because it's new.
Right. Well, and that's where I was saying that if you're in a space where academia and science is all there is,
right,
you can break out by being different, by not. But if you're in a space, like you said, life coaches or whatever, and everyone around you is, I know sometimes people say woo woo, right?
Yeah,
and you don't want to be that.
A lot of that. Yeah.
Right. Then you can, if you have the science piece and you have an interest in it, which I'm guessing if you're a listener, you do, that it can be a really good strength. You shouldn't feel like you have to hide it because not everyone else in your field does it. It's actually something that can really help you stand out and attract the people you want to be working with.
And life coaching is one example, but I mean, an example that I've talked about a lot is Simon Sinek, right? I mean, he's this extremely successful sort of like professional speaker kind of guy. And he wrote a book and did a TED Talk called Start With Why. And it's perfectly good. But if you think about it, that's something that your dad might say to you. It's like, listen, kid, if you're going to get a job and start a business, start with why you're doing it. What do you really want? It's not groundbreaking. It's good advice. And the way that this guy carries himself, he wears little glasses and he speaks in this kind of half British accent and like this and that. So I thought he was a social scientist. I just assumed because he's always talking about the neural pathways and the hormones and the thing and how the brain responds. And he uses all this stuff. He's an ad man. Like he literally was a professional advertising executive. So he knew he's in this kind of world of like business gurus, which is like life coaches. They're useful. I'm a bit of one myself, but like, it can be anything. I mean, there are books out there like How to Be a Leader, and what he did was he took common sense stuff that would have been common sense that you wouldn't pay your dad 50 cents for. And he put all this scientific rigor and he gets paid $150,000 for a talk.
I was so glad when I saw Simon Sinek mentioned in the book. And, he really shows, I think, the confidence piece, which I know we talked 100%. About already. The way he's framing his message is different than what everybody else does. He's picking these very great storytelling examples. He has some of the science impacts with it, but he's also a master of, and I know we didn't talk about this, but it is in the book, of the repetitiveness and the quick grabs where like you can see people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it, right? He says that like 86 times.
I choose to be an optimist. I choose to be an optimist. I choose to be an optimist, Yeah.
In the Start With Why, he says that, 85 times, but you love it every single time you hear it. And so
people love slogans. I mean, it's, he's such a master at that. I mean, I remember the thing that just blew me away with the confidence piece. He did that video that just everybody loved where he talked about like, in his kind way, how horrible millennials are, and he basically was like, parents, I'm not going to get this right, but it was like, parents gave their millennial children participation trophies. Brains form in this way when there's no struggle and no qualifying words. They do this happens. And I was like, and everyone was like, oh, it's so true. All millennials? Really?
Right. No.
Millennials from Compton got participation trophies.
Mm-hmm.
And, it has nothing to do with the economy. The fact that there's no post-war boom, could that have something to do with like the level of certitude that helicopter parenting was the sole factor for all the struggles that millennials are having? I'm not saying he's right or wrong, and it is a factor, but he just knows he could like a different kind of speaker who probably wouldn't get as many people to follow him or pay money to him would have said, in certain circumstances, a certain percentage of people born between this year and this year were raised by parents who were reacting against how their parents raised them. But you also have to consider the sociological factors, socioeconomic factors. And that would have been an academic book that 14 people would have read.
Right. Go, blah.
But it's more accurate. It's more accurate. Yeah.
The framing of that is so impactful where you say essentially the same thing, but one is quotable and interesting and the other you're kind of going asleep before.
And confident, right?
Yeah.
To your point, it's people love certainty. That's another heuristic. Most people are under the impression that if you're saying something with extreme certitude, that you must know what you're talking about.
Right. Yes, definitely. Definitely. While I want to be respectful of your time, and I'm so thankful I could talk to you for hours and hours for sure. And we will definitely have a link to the book in the show notes. And in addition, what's the best way for people to find out about you, to connect for everyone who wants to learn more, which I'm sure they will? What's the best way?
Yeah, I mean, thank you for that opportunity and I had so much fun too. It's so great to talk to someone who you can go really deep with because, you have such an understanding of sort of this general field that we're both, in. Yeah, I mean, I think for your listeners who are kind of a knowledge seeking bunch, I do this thing called the Hype Book Club. So it's hypereads.com. And so I'm always reading these books, both for the research of this book, but also everything that led up to this that caused me to read this book on not so much the Simon Sinek's and 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, although there's value in all of that stuff. But I'm reading biographies of cult leaders and weird social psychology books and, things like that. And I started sharing those book recommendations with people, and they weren't getting them from other places. So it's become a pretty fun, popular thing that I send out and a good way to keep in touch. So it's hypereads.com. And my company is Microfame Media. So that's microfamemedia.com if you want to check out what we do.
Perfect. We will have links for both of those in the show notes. I know that I'm intrigued by the Hype Reads and just something different. It makes it kind of fun. And like you said, there's something to be learned in all areas if you're curious and looking for it. And I think the Hype Handbook does a really great job of showcasing how that can be applied. So thank you again so much for joining me on the show, and I look forward to talking to you again soon.
It was my pleasure.
Thank you again to Michael F. Schein for joining me on the show today. What do you think about hype now that you've heard Michael talk about it on the show? Did your perspective change at all from what you thought going in? I'd love to hear about it, and I'm sure he would too. So please do tag us both on social media. You can find me as The Brainy Biz everywhere, and his handles are waiting for you in the show notes. Let us know your thoughts and insights on hype, and if you plan to use it in your business. There's also a link in the show notes to get your copy of the Hype Handbook, which has 12 ways to use hype in your business and a lot of great stories about each of them. We only covered a few today, but the chapters that break these down include the following list of strategies. Make war, not love. Create your own secret society. Perfect your packaging. Give the little babies their milk. Become a trickster, at least for a little while. Become a magus, which is like a magician. Find a void and fill it. Make it scientific. Prayers, spells, and symbols. Embrace theater and drama. Set down a rock for your followers to cling to. And finally, fetishize work. Master effortless doing. To learn what all of those mean, read some great stories and get tips for including these hype strategies in your business to increase your success, you need to get your own copy of the Hype Handbook. Again, there's a link in the show notes, along with ways to get in touch with Michael, learn more about his work as president of Microfame Media, read his articles on Forbes, Inc. and Psychology Today, and so much more. It's all waiting for you right within the app you're listening to or at thebrainybusiness.com/143. And a fun little note about my own book, What Your Customer Wants and Can't Tell You, which is now available on pre-sale on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and more. The timing of when Michael reached out about featuring the Brainy Business in that Psychology Today article I mentioned at the top of the show was right as I was finishing my book. And even though we didn't really know each other at all, Michael generously offered to be an early reader and potentially provide a quote to include in the book. I sent it along to him, and one of the things he said after reading the book in his very kind response was so powerful. It ended up being the featured quote on the front of the book. There only gets to be one of those, so it's a very big deal. It's also the featured quote on Amazon, and I'm guessing you'll see it in ads for the book as we get closer to that May 11th, 2021 launch date and beyond. So what does it say? the most important business book to come out in years. I mean, does it get better than that? I must say, when that came back, I was truly speechless and amazed. What a wonderful thing to say. And it means so much coming from someone I had only met once for, I think, 30 minutes over Zoom. And now that I know him a little better, I think it means even more because I really respect his opinion and insight. So thank you again to Michael F. Schein for everything, for serendipitously reaching out at the right moment, for offering to be an early reader of the book, and for saying such wonderful things about it, for listing the Brainy Business as the #1 psychology podcast people in business should listen to on Psychology Today, and of course, for joining me on the show to talk about your great book, The Hype Handbook. Again, there are links for everything, including for you to pre-order a copy of my new book, the most important business book to come out in years, according to today's guest, Michael F. Schein, within the show notes at thebrainybusiness.com/143. And as you're a friend of the Brainy Business, can I ask you for a little favor? I'm hoping you'll help spread the word about my book, What Your Customer Wants and Can't Tell You. It's my goal to help as many people as possible to learn about and begin applying behavioral economics in their businesses with great results. When you think about the people you know who would love to have a guide to applying behavioral economics in business to uplevel their career, who comes to mind? Will you share the link with them as well? Maybe post about it on your social media and be sure to tag me. And of course, thank you to everyone who has done so already. I appreciate it more than I can say. Thank you all for your support and kindness. You really are amazing, and I appreciate you. And as we close out, one more thank you to Michael F. Schein for joining me on the show today. It was wonderful to chat with and learn from you. Next week, on episode 144, we're doing the first behavioral economics analysis episode in over a year. And this is one in very high demand, Disney. It's going to be a lot of magical fun. You won't want to miss it. Until then, thanks again for listening and learning with me. And remember to be thoughtful.
Thank you for listening to the Brainy Business Podcast. Melina offers virtual strategy sessions, workshops, and other services to help businesses be more brain-friendly. For more free resources, visit thebrainybusiness.com.